Hi everyone, and welcome to the Publishing Performance Show. Today I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by JD Barker, who is a New York Times bestselling author. So welcome to the show, JD.
Hey Teddy, how you doing?
I'm really good, thank you. How are you?
I'm doing good.
I should really say welcome back to the show after we had our really short session in Author Nation.
Yeah, we did like the couple minutes real quick, and which was fun. But it's nice to be able to sit down and actually be able to talk.
Yeah, definitely. How did you find Author Nation?
I honestly, I loved it. It was my first time there. And, it's funny because I've known Joe for a little while now. And, I came out of the traditional world. I've indie published, I've done traditional, I've done hybrid. But when you're on the traditional side, like they actually told us not to go to 20 books to 50K. Like they didn't want traditional authors at that. Like the publishers would tell us just not to go.
Right.
So I'm really glad to see the rebranding because honestly, like everything about publishing is getting very blurry. I don't know that there really is a traditional and an indie anymore. I've been calling the traditional publishers legacy publishers, mainly because like they haven't changed their ways. Like the last book that I gave them, they sent me a PowerPoint presentation with their marketing plan, and it was literally the same one that I'd seen with the last book that I'd given at Random House, 4 or 5 years earlier. It's like they did a find and replace on a PowerPoint presentation and just kind of moved on. But like they didn't change any of their tactics. And I love the indie world because like as an indie author, like if you picture boats in a harbor, indie authors can make changes so fast. We're like those little speedboats zipping around, and the traditional publishers are like a giant cruise ship. Just it takes them an hour to make a left turn.
Yeah.
But like the indies can do circles around them. So I love the vibe there. And the other thing I got from it is honestly, like I've been to so many conferences, a lot of the really big ones, like BoucherCon and stuff like that. They're great at promoting debut authors and they're fantastic at promoting the really big names, but they don't have a whole lot there for those people that are in the middle, which is honestly 99% of the people that attend these conferences. And it feels to me like Author Nation really fills that gap. They teach you how to get from that first book, to the 10th book to, working towards becoming a household name, which is what I'm shooting for.
Yeah, awesome. And were there any particular talks you went to which you thought which stood out to you as being really interesting?
It was fun for me to meet some people like, Kevin Anderson for the first time because
Yes.
I've known him through other people that, we've got a lot of mutual friends. So that was fantastic. His presentation, just on his life story, to me, it's so inspiring because like most people don't like, I've only been a full-time author for 10 years. I just had my 10-year anniversary from the time my first book was published. Like so much can change. I've written books with James Patterson and like he came from literally nothing. He grew up in a boarding house, so it's like, it's amazing to hear those kind of stories. And I love to like those are the ones that always get me. So Kevin's speech was great.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I really enjoyed that. And I had Kevin Anderson. He was on one of my first guests on the show, which I was so happy about because I kind of just emailed him out of hoping and he said yes. So it was great to actually meet him in person as well. That was awesome. What you just said actually kind of led quite nicely onto my first question. So your first book, Forsaken, you published that yourself. What was the decision? What went into the decision to publishing it yourself rather than going through a publisher?
I honestly, I fell into indie publishing because I completely screwed up the querying process. Like I knew I had written a good book. I'd worked as a book doctor and a ghostwriter for 20 some years. I hit the New York Times bestseller list 6 different times with other, books that I had written for other people. They basically had other names on the cover. So I knew how to write a good book, but I had no clue how to query agents. So when I was ready to query for that book, I bought a list of agents. I sent them all basically a form letter, to whom it may concern. Here's my novel. Here's what it's about. I didn't bother to look at any of their websites to see what their criteria was, and every agent's got different criteria. This one wants Times New Roman for a font, this one wants Arial, this one wants a PDF, this one wants a Word document. I didn't look at any of that. I just sent them all the same thing, and surprise, I didn't get a whole lot of response from them. So I just decided, well, like I knew I had a good book, I knew I could indie publish, so I learned all the rules and basically made a mental note that if I was going to do this, the book would have to come out on par with something coming out of Random House. Like I wasn't going to just put it on Amazon and hit the publish button. So I hired professionals across the board for cover, for formatting, for copy editing, all that kind of stuff. And ultimately I put it out as a hardcover and an audiobook and ebook all on the same day. 6 months later, we released a paperback. So I followed the same model that I saw the traditional guys doing, but I wanted it to, because in my mind, they were my competition. Right. So I wanted it to look and feel as if it was coming from one of them. I felt that if it didn't, I was already losing the game.
Yeah. So your first books, it sounds like it was quite a while in the making. If you're already in the industry before where you're writing for other people, did it take you a long time to get that first book out?
No, I wrote that book in probably about 4 months, because I'd been writing for, like once you get like a couple of books behind you, like you learn the formula, you learn, what works for you, what doesn't work for you. So I can knock out a book in about 3 to 4 months. With that particular one, I was basically writing as a side gig because I'd been told my entire life, you can't make a living as a writer. You have to get a real job. So I went into the corporate world. I was working in finance, and I would come home and I would write at night. And that's when I did the book doctor and the ghostwriter stuff. And like over that time, I had all those books that hit the New York Times list, with other people's names on the cover, which gets really old when you're the one actually doing the work. So my wife came up with this crazy plan. We had to walk away from the lifestyle because I wanted to quit my job, but I couldn't do it because we had a big house, we had cars, we had a boat, it was expensive. So she came up with this plan. We sold everything that we owned. We bought a tiny little duplex in Pittsburgh, lived in one side, rented out the other side, and basically got to the point where I could live off of savings and write that first book. So that's when I did it. And it took about 4 months to get that first draft done, maybe another month or two to polish it.
Wow. What were you doing before that made you, and what was the reason you wanted to go into writing your own book? Was it just because you got fed up of seeing it on the New York Times list? Is that it?
Yeah, it's like a lot of the books that I did were memoirs and autobiographies, but I would write them for somebody else in their voice. Their name would go on the cover. Those didn't bother me quite so much. But the last one that really got me, I was hired by one of the top 5 publishers. They had an author who was due for, his book was due, but he also had to go out on book tour, and he was only halfway done with the novel. So they brought me in to basically finish that book as a ghostwriter. So they sent me the first half of the book that he wrote. He gave me his outline. I worked with him over the phone, but I essentially wrote the second half of that book. But, obviously I received 0 credit for it. And then I did another one immediately after that where I wrote the entire book. And again, somebody else's name went on the cover. And like when I saw those hit the New York Times list, I just felt, like now I'm ready. And I could have, I was 43 when I published my first book. I could have easily started publishing books back in my 20s, but I don't know that I'd be where I am today because I feel like I needed those 20 years to really learn what I was doing. So when I finally wrote one on my own, I felt like I had a good handle on the entire process.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Now, with your books, your first one was indie published, but since then you've had books which have gone down the traditional route. You've had hybrid published. You've had also, now you've got your own sort of special relationship with Simon Schuster, which I'd like to talk about in a bit. But what's been the difference between having those different types of publishing for your business?
Well, I feel like indie publishing kind of ruined me because if I had gone directly into traditional, I wouldn't have known what it was like, Right. But, my second, I sold a lot of copies of that first book. It sold about 250,000 titles. And as an indie published title, that's pretty good. And when you do that, you end up on the radar of the traditional guys. They watch for that. So when I wrote my second book, which was called The Fourth Monkey, and my agent took it out, I had no trouble getting an agent that time. She took it out and we immediately started getting offers. And I ended up, it went to auction and it went to HMH, which is now part of HarperCollins. And I got a 7-figure deal out of it. There was a movie and a TV show attached. So it was like a complete opposite of, like indie publishing that title. But I had to give up control. Like you hand in that book and like they can change anything. They can change the title. They can change the cover, like the size of your name on the cover. Like none of those decisions are yours anymore. And that bothered me a little bit. But, there was also the economic side. Getting a 7-figure deal, for my second book was fantastic. I mean, don't get me wrong. Getting that advance check, I would have never said, I wouldn't say no to that. But, you have to pay that back. It's an advance. And when you're traditionally published, you're paying it back with, pennies on the dollar. You earn roughly 70 cents on the dollar as an indie. And on the traditional side, you're lucky if you get 15 to 20 cents. So you have to pay that advance back with those smaller little increments. And then to continue to earn, you have to sell a lot more books than you would have to as an indie. So I got a taste for it. And, so I immediately did the math, with every traditional book that I published. And I published a few through the traditional market after that. And then it got to the point where, again, I got fed up. I tend to get fed up a lot when I run into a brick wall, when I feel like there's a brass ring out there that I'm not holding yet. So I called my agent. I wrote a book called A Caller's Game. I basically destroy like half of New York. It's a big action adventure book. But I told her, listen, I'm going to keep English rights for myself. I'm going to indie publish those through my own imprint. You can go ahead and sell all the foreign rights like you normally do. And at that point, I'm in about 150 different countries, about 20 to 30 different languages. So there was still a big market there for her to work on, but I wanted to publish English. So I called that basically hybrid publishing at the time. And I'm not sure if that's what other people were calling it, but it didn't, not too many people were doing it. But we did the next couple of books that way. And I really liked it because I got to retain all the control. Because I created my own covers, I actually licensed those covers back. So when the foreign publishers wanted my image from my American cover, I could actually charge them for using it, which, to me felt like the better business, decision. So I did that for a couple of books. And then I guess it was about a year and a half ago, I wrote a book called Behind a Closed Door, sent it off to my agent. And at this point I was with a company called Writer's House out of New York. He took it out. He started shopping it to the publishers. We immediately got film interest, and we ended up signing an option for a film deal on that. And the book was about to go to auction. We had a couple of big publishers that wanted it. And I got a phone call from a friend of mine who worked at Random House. And she said, listen, we're about to offer on your book, but you need to turn it down. And I asked her why. And she said, well, the editor who wants your book is about to get laid off. We're about to go through a round of firings, and that editor is on that list. I got a similar phone call from somebody at HarperCollins about a week or two later. And then all these layoffs happened across the industry. And if you've ever known anybody that had a book that was with a publisher and you lose your editor, that book can sit there in limbo forever, depending on your contract. If you don't have a way out, like, they don't have to publish that book. So that really scared me. So my last real job, I worked in finance in the corporate world. I reached out to some friends of mine that knew people at the private equity firm that had recently bought Simon & Schuster. And ultimately I struck a deal where they allowed me to create my own imprint on Simon & Schuster. So I can publish whatever I want, whenever I want, but I have Simon & Schuster as my backbone. So they handle all of my print sales and distribution. So for me, that's the golden ticket. It's the best of both worlds, because I've got all that freedom as an indie. I've got the financial, ability to earn as an indie, but I've got, one of the top 5 publishers behind me. So I can get those indie titles in those places that you can't really get to as an indie author. I can get them into Costco, the grocery stores, drugstores, you name it. So I really like it. And I honestly think that's where the future is, because if you think about it, if you take a big name indie author, they put out a book, they make $1 million off of that book. If a traditional publisher offers them $1 million check, they're going to say no, because there's no incentive for them to take that money. They know what they can do on their own without the headaches of having to deal with that world. But, you give them the ability to use that distribution system. That's a game changer if you're an indie, because, their print costs are next to nothing. And like I said, they can get you in those places you just can't get to. So I think you're going to see a lot more of these in the coming years.
The relationship you have with Simon & Schuster, is that quite unique to you, or are you seeing other successful authors have a sort of similar relationship as well now?
I don't know of any other authors that have signed this. I've seen a lot of small imprints that have signed up for similar deals, but I think the authors are coming.
Right, I see. And how does that relationship work now that you've got that sort of special relationship? How does it work in terms of like your income and like getting the books out into different places?
Yeah, I mean, it's honestly not that different from, like indie publishing a title, other than I have to give them, a lot of the pieces a little bit earlier than I normally would. They need the interior files, the cover jacket, all that kind of stuff. I have to work with specific designers that are familiar with the system that Simon & Schuster has in place, that sort of thing. But otherwise it's not that different. I mean, I was already printing in bulk before this. That was one of the other things that I learned. Like, you can do, if you're just starting off, you can do one-off printing through companies like Ingram Spark, yep. Which is fantastic, because it at least gets those hardcovers in the hands of your readers. But your margins are crazy small, if you're printing one copy at a time. So I always encourage people, when you get to the financial point where you can do bulk, print 1,000, print 5,000, print 10,000. There's plenty of companies out there that'll do it, and you can get your print costs down and make substantially more. So to me, working with Simon & Schuster is very similar to that. I have to put in a pretty decent sized print order, and those books get warehoused, but my margins are exceptional.
Yeah.
So there's a little bit of a learning curve. They've got a very robust system in place, but in general, like they've been a fantastic partner on this.
That's interesting that when you get a certain level of success, you can end up using Simon & Schuster as your print-on-demand company.
That's essentially what it turned into. I mean, I used a company called Baker & Taylor for a little while in between, because most bookstores or libraries, they tend to order from either Ingram or Baker & Taylor. Most indie authors only pick one. They tend to go with Ingram because it's the low-hanging fruit, and it's the one that we tend to talk about the most at conferences and shows like this. But Baker & Taylor is a great way to offset that, and I use them quite a bit too. But I think you're going to see a lot of presses, like the cost of even print on demand is getting cheaper. They're getting smarter about it, even printing in color, like that's becoming an option. So I think the whole world is evolving. And what really bugged me about the traditional world is a lot of the large publishers aren't evolving with it. Simon & Schuster, to their credit, they've stepped out and they did something like this. And I don't know that they would have done this 2 years ago. I think this happened because they're owned by private equity. Private equity picked up Simon & Schuster. They see them as a business that does X, and they look at all those pieces that particular business has, and they try to figure out how to make more money using those pieces. So I think they're kind of forcing Simon & Schuster to think differently, and to their credit, Simon & Schuster is willing to do it.
Yeah. That's so interesting. Now, I mean, a lot of the books I write, or all the books I write, are non-fiction, and so I see a majority of my books being sold as paperback because I think people like to buy paperback and write on them, especially for non-fiction books. When I speak to a lot of fiction authors, most of their sales come through ebooks, but it sounds like you do more of your sales through the paperback. So, how does it work if you're selling your ebooks as well?
I think it has a lot to do with the way that I've been published to date. So my first book was indie published, so that one by far sold way more ebooks than print. And then it was available in hardcover and paperback, and but mainly through KDP, so that's what people bought. But then my next couple of books were traditionally published. So as I built my fan base, those fans became accustomed to going into a bookstore and finding my title, walking into Costco or the grocery store and finding one of my books. So when I went to the hybrid approach after that, they expected to find my books in those places. So I had to make sure that they got there. I think it's because I've been bouncing back and forth between the two, my reader bases has come with me. And I think that's very important. Even from a pricing, standpoint, like my ebooks I price them at around $9.97, I think is
Okay.
the bulk of them. I'm able to do that because, like when I've got a book coming out in March with James Patterson called The Writer. I think the ebook for that one's 14 something.
Wow.
So my fan base is accustomed to paying these larger dollar amounts. I think it would be very tricky if I would have come out of the gate, pricing my ebooks at, $3.99, $4.99, you can't just change your price and double, but I've been at these price levels the entire time, which I think has been helpful.
Yeah. Now, you talked about your relationship with James Patterson and writing in partnerships, and you've actually written a few different books with partnerships. How do you find it working with other writers? Do you ever have any conflicts? And do you have any ways of resolving that?
No, I honestly like it. I mean, because I came up in this world, working as a book doctor and a ghostwriter, I essentially worked with other people. I've been collaborating my entire career. So it actually felt odd to me to all of a sudden be working on books all by myself. I missed having that sounding board. I mean, the nice thing about working with somebody else is, you've got a particular idea, for a book, they've got a particular idea, and it could be totally different from yours. And when you mix those two things together, it's like peanut butter and chocolate. It just works. But you need to, divide and conquer, I think, very early on. You need to figure out where everybody's strengths are. When I work with a co-author, it's very similar to, like two chefs being in the kitchen. If you're both making breakfast and you both try to make eggs at the same time, it's going to be a problem. But if you've got one person making bacon while the other one's making eggs, then it all works out. So you've got to learn to, figure out where everybody excels and base on that. I love working with other people because they bring different things to the table too. So I've got a book I just released back in November called Heavier are the Stones. And I wrote it with a woman named Christine Daigle, who's a neuropsychologist. So she brought that entire profession into the writing process. And, me, I could have faked it. I could have done some Google searches, read some books, did some research, and, come up with enough to make it seem believable. But when you have an authentic voice like that working with you, you can't beat that. So I love working with co-authors just mainly because of that.
That authentic voice thing is so interesting with novel writers, because I was speaking to James Davis, who's one of the Author Nation organizers, and because he's got a background in medicine, a lot of his books have that medical standpoint, and it's basically his unique selling point. Like, people can't get that knowledge that he's got, because how can you write about medical things if you aren't from that background? So it's interesting that you've also used that to make your book stand out as well.
Yeah, I mean, I try to be as authentic as I can, even when I'm working. I've got cops that are on speed dial. I've got friends at the FBI. I mean, when you write enough books, we all have those contacts out there. My sister runs a hospital in Florida, so if I need to poison somebody with something unique, she's the first email I send off, and she'll run down to the lab, the pathology lab, and she'll get some questions answered for me. So, I try to keep it authentic that way. But it's honestly, it's easier and more fun when you've got that, somebody who actually has that knowledge base working with you.
Yeah, definitely. What's the best poison to use, do you think?
I like to think of things outside of the box. So I killed somebody with a drug called lisinopril once, which is a blood pressure medication. And if somebody overdoses on it, it can actually cause them to stroke out.
Right.
So unless they're actually looking for it, they don't actually realize that it's an overdose, that it was actually caused by that.
Right.
There's lots of fun ways to kill people. My Google search, if anybody ever checked my Google search, I'd be in a lot of trouble.
I'll put that drug in the resources section for anyone who wants to buy some later on.
Yeah.
How did you find yourself working with James Patterson on that series of books?
It kind of fell together when Fourth Monkey was coming out. My editor mailed copies of the ARCs to pretty much every big name author he could find, hoping to get that blurb for the back cover. And Patterson happened to be on that list, and he read Fourth Monkey and he liked it enough to reach out to me. He lives in Palm Beach, and I've got a family in Palm Beach, so we just made plans to get together when I was in that area, and we just started talking. And initially we didn't think we were going to be able to work together because he's a hardcore outliner. I was a pantser at the time, or discovery writer, however you want to phrase it, but coming at each other from basically two different camps. So we didn't think it was going to work. So we kind of left that conversation, thinking we wouldn't be able to do anything. And then a couple months later, we talked again, and he's like, you know what, let's try this. Let's pants a novel. So I'm the only guy who's ever gotten James Patterson to write a book without an outline. And we literally went chapter back and forth. I would write some crazy scenario, paint him into some impossible situation, send him the pages thinking there's no way he's going to get out of this. And 15 minutes later, he not only got out of it, but he put me into something even crazier. We wrote the whole book that way, which was a lot of fun. But after we finished it, he called me up and he said, all right, now we're going to try it my way. I'm going to send you an outline. And he sent me an outline for a book called The Noise. And, honestly, after I wrote that one with him, it went so seamlessly, and it was so easy to write that book when you already had that framework in front of us. I haven't gone back. I've been outlining everything ever since.
Oh, wow. So it's actually changed your whole perspective on it.
I tried to convert him into pantsing, and ultimately he switched me and brought me over to his camp.
You should get some James Patterson pants for your website as some merch to sell to your audience.
Yeah.
With the outline that you've now started writing, how do you approach that? Have you got a particular structure you like to follow for each book that you write?
I tend to come up with the plot or the scenario first, then I come up with my characters. I see them as two very separate things. Like I have to know my characters inside and out. I have to know them as well as real people before I can start writing that book. Because if I have two different people standing in front of me and I present them both with a problem, they're both going to give me different answers. And like your characters need to be that way too. So I fully develop everything before I drop them in there. From an outlining standpoint, I kind of approach it it's almost like an airplane that's getting closer and closer to land. Like I throw my big bullet points in first, like something I want to happen at the beginning, something at the middle, something at the end. And then I just keep circling through it, and I just start filling things in between, and I get closer and closer and closer, just getting more and more detailed. And before I know it, at this point, I've got 30 or 40 pages in an outline before I start writing the book. But I've got that entire framework there, which I love. I live on a little island. We were talking about this before we started recording, off the coast of Portsmouth up in New England. And I do a run every day. It's about 4 miles to do a lap around the island. And I used to spend that time thinking about, what I was going to write the next day, basically, where's the story going? What's coming next? And now that I've got outlines in front of me, I spend that same brain power, and I think about how do I make what comes next better? Because I already know what's happening. So how do I improve it? And I found that the stories have been much tighter and much cleaner and much easier to write.
Yeah. So for people who are just starting out, would you recommend going down that outline approach rather than just writing? Or do you think it is really personal to everyone who does it?
I think everybody should try, each method, until you land on something that works for you. I mean, I've got a podcast called Writers Inc. where we interview a ton of authors. I'm constantly picking their brain on their process. I've known Dean Koontz for years. And one of the things that he told me that worked really well for him is he starts his day by reading whatever he wrote the previous day and editing it and cleaning it up. He does 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 words. By the time he gets to the end of editing that, he continues the story. He's already back in the story, so it's very easy to just keep going and going and going, and just repeats that every day. By the time he gets to the end, he's basically done with the first draft, and there's very little to do, as far as rewrites go, because he's done all the work up front. And I've been kind of following that, for the last few years too. So I'm always picking up tidbits, from these guys. I tend to ask some of the bigger names, but I purposely do that because they're doing well. I don't want to ask the guy who's selling 100 books a month. I want to talk to the guy who's selling 100,000 a month.
Yeah, 100%. Now, with your books, obviously you've had quite a lot of success now, and I know you do a lot of speaking at conferences and Comic-Con type events and things like that. But what marketing do you do for your books? And was there anything you did that kind of turned the dial, where you did it and you noticed, oh, actually, that's made quite a big difference to the book sales?
I always try to come up with something different from what I see other people doing. So, every time I've got a new book to promote, I'll sit down, I'll make a list of what I see everybody else doing to promote their titles. And then once I have that, I make a brand new list of things that nobody's doing. I try to come up with something that's outside the box. So to give you an example, I've got a book coming out in May. It's called Something I Keep Upstairs. And it's based on the island where I live. So I live on an island. And if we go to our beach, there's a tiny little island right off our coast that has a house on it. And it's like maybe a quarter mile off the shore. door, and like you can see the house, but you can't really tell what's happening out there. So I lived here for years, and like that was just inspiring to me. Like I knew there was a story there. So ultimately I wrote this book, and the tagline for the book is, "For a haunted house to be born, somebody has to die." So it's about a kid who, he's 16, he inherits that island from his grandmother. She passes away. So he's 16 years old. He inherits this house, on an island all by itself. So him and his friends do exactly what you expect them to do. They turn it into a party house, but that gets old after a while, and they just decide, well, what can we do to turn this into a haunted house? So they start off with, a Ouija board and doing this and doing that, the things that you would expect. But again, the tagline is, "For a haunted house to be born, somebody has to die."
Yeah.
So you know where the story is going. But to promote that book, it's a real house. It's on a real island. So I'm working with the people that actually own the property, the city of Kittery, and we're giving away an overnight stay. So, one person is going to win, and they're going to, be able to take 3 of their friends and spend a night in this haunted house on their own private island. So that's how we're, one of the things that we're doing to promote the book, which is something I've never seen anybody else do.
No.
Like we've got Facebook ads running right now to promote that, and the reception has been phenomenal. So I always try to come up with something that's a little bit different, because you can obviously get Facebook ads to promote stuff and other ads, but word of mouth is what really does it, whether it's book sales or, promotions or whatever. You need people talking.
That's awesome. I kind of want to win the prize myself so I can go and stay on the island. Have you had a chance to go out to the island yourself?
I've been out there from the get-go. Like they completely restored it when this guy basically just took on this project, and to be able to do this is just insane. But like the house was falling apart. There was literally a foot of bat guano, bat shit in the bottom of this place, because it was just filled with bats, big holes in the ceiling. It was just completely coming apart. He spent the last 4 or 5 years just raising money and renovating it and bringing it back to life. So I've been out there as that's been going on. In today's world, in the real world, it's going to be opening as a museum. Okay. So, but people are going to be able to spend the night there as, not only part of my contest, but they're going to be able to rent it to stay the night there too. So it's kind of a mix of both. But like the story that I came up with in the book, I took a ton of stuff from like actual events, things that really happened. I mixed the fact with fiction, which makes it that much more fun, because, like even people stumble into this contest, they research the house and they start seeing all these things, that really happened there. And it's, it's inspiring. We're working on getting like ghost hunters out there and things like that too, which is just, it adds to the fun.
Yeah, definitely. Now, obviously, that's quite an extreme marketing tactic that you can do, like as someone in your position. But was there anything you did when you started out, maybe that was one of the more different techniques, or was it simply down to advertising and word of mouth?
I tend to look at everything a little differently. So I'll take TikTok as an example.
Yeah.
I think a lot of authors have tried to figure out how to sell books on TikTok. And, as soon as I started following the platform, I, watched other authors on there. Like nobody wants to see me dancing around holding my book. Like that's not going to work. So ultimately what I did is I paid a college kid to curate the email addresses from BookTok influencers, basically people that reviewed books on TikTok. We got a list together about, I think we're at 4,000 or 5,000 some people now. And then I created a weekly mailing list, very similar to BookBub. I work with all the big 5 publishers. They send me ARC copies and I make those available to the influencers. So once a week, influencers on TikTok get an email with 4 or 5 titles they can pick, and they can get books sent to them for free in exchange for a review of that particular book. So me as the owner of that, I can take my own titles and I can drop them into that list anytime I want and basically expose them to those thousands and thousands of influencers who have millions and millions of followers, which is much better than me trying to just create a profile and generate something, on my own. So I look at all these things that way. There's no other, like that to me was, something organic, like that made sense. But me trying to just, create little videos and snippets, like that wasn't going to move the needle. Yeah. Facebook is very similar. Like I don't do a lot on Facebook, but I've got 18 different accounts on Facebook in different languages. I pay other people to do that for me because it just makes more sense.
Yeah. I think outsourcing makes quite a big difference as soon as you can afford to do whichever bit you're finding difficult, to really start turning that dial, because you've only got your own time. And so you can only control what you can control.
Yeah, but I think the one thing you have to keep in mind, like I had mentioned, like this, I've been doing this for 10 years as a full-time author, but like I started in the same place everybody else does. I had 0 people on my mailing list, 0 followers on the basic, the social media platforms. I built it organically over time. And that's what you really want. I mean, there's a lot of things you can do that are going to, score big numbers. I know back in the day, a lot of people gave away like their first book in a series, built up their mailing list and then, hope that the readers would come along. That never worked for me because, whenever I picked up readers on a free book, they wanted more free books. So I never really stuck with that. But, again, if I see everybody else doing something at that point, it's played out. I need something new.
Yeah, for sure. Now, for people who are just starting out, what tips would you give them for getting their book out there as much as possible?
I think the first thing that they have to really think about is just make sure that it's a 5-star read. Don't be quick to hit that publish button. I know so many authors, they try to get an agent and they get rejected, and then they just say, well, I'm going to go ahead and self-publish it. Like, that's not the takeaway from that. The real takeaway should be, why did this book get rejected so many times? Talk to those people and try to find out that reason, because if you get 2 or 3 people that explain why the book, why they didn't want it, you can fix those things. Because that book, before it gets out on any platform, it needs to be a 5-star read. If you have to get professional covers, professional editing all across the board, because like I mentioned earlier, like, your competition is the top 5. It's Penguin Random House. It's not the indie author that lives down the street from you. 1 million books were published. Like, the first year I published my book, I think it was 700,000 books were published that year. It quickly broke 1 million. And last year, 2024, there was 2.4 million books published. Your book is one of them.
Yeah.
So you have to figure out how to make it stand out in that crowd. And if you take any shortcuts, what ends up happening is you hit that publish button on Amazon. Your friends and family review that book, so you get 15, 25-star reviews, and then all of a sudden the real readers find it, and then they start pointing out the typos and the developmental problems and this problem and that problem, and before you know it, your career is more or less dead, because people read those reviews before they buy the book, and then they pass on it. If you try to get into the traditional world and you put out a book as an indie and it didn't do well, that's the first thing they see. As soon as you hang up with an agent or you send an agent a query, they Google you. They go on Amazon, they see what you're up to, they see all of that, and if they see you've got a book out there that's ranked 2.3 stars, and it's ranked in the millions on Amazon, like, that's your track record. You've only got one shot at this. You got to get it right.
Yeah. And for you mentioned you've got a newsletter. How do you use your newsletter to speak to your audience? Have you got any particular tips that you could share with people for that?
I've got a couple different ones. So I've got one that's geared strictly towards reviewers or the media. So people in the press, people on social media, stuff like that. They're on that list. I've got another one for bookstores. I've got another one for libraries, and then I've got one for my general fan base. And I use all of them very differently. So the reviewers and people like like you'll get an email about a book months before it comes out, offering ARC copies. I use NetGalley quite a bit to make those books available. I try to be as visible as I possibly can. So libraries, bookstores, reviewers, those guys all get these things ahead of time. I've got a lot of books coming out because I am working with a lot of co-authors. I've got 12 titles coming out over the next year. So my typical newsletter for just my fan base, it's gone from just this book is coming out in 4 months to these 7 books are coming out. So I have to be very careful with that. I don't want to send them a message every couple of days. So I try to limit it to maybe 2 or 3 times a month and try to keep it fresh, but get all of those titles in front of them.
Yeah, amazing. Now, as you mentioned, you've got 12 projects you're working on this year. So could you give us a bit of an insight into the upcoming projects that you've got over the next few months? Or the next books?
Yeah, I mean, the one... Do you remember a movie called Flatliners from the 90s?
I remember the name, but I haven't seen it.
Yeah, so this is a movie. It's one of my all-time favorites. It's got Kiefer Sutherland, Julia Roberts, Billy Baldwin, Kevin Bacon, like all these people at the start of their career. And it's essentially about, a bunch of medical students, and they decide to kill each other just to see if there's an afterlife. And it's like the coolest premise. I've always loved this movie. Years later, the guy who wrote it, Peter Filardi, he happened to be attached to one of my other projects off in Hollywood. He was writing Dracul for us. So I got to talking to him about it, and I told him I had an idea to reboot that franchise. And at the time, the studio still owned the rights, so we couldn't do anything. And then this past January, about a year ago, he called me up and said, "Hey, I got the rights back. Do you still want to do something?" So we're writing a novel to reboot the franchise, which as far as I know, it's only been done one time. They did it with Michael Mann did it with Heat 2. So essentially they wrote the book first. So we're writing a book to, which has a brand new, fresh storyline that it looks like, we've got so much interest coming from Hollywood. I'm pretty sure this one's going to get made pretty quick.
Wow.
But we're just kind of reversing it. Instead of the movie coming out first and then a book, we're writing the book first based on a movie. So we'll see where that one goes. But that's the one that's on my desk now. I should be done with that in about another month or 2.
Oh, nice. Would that be the first book that you've had turned into a film that's successfully gone out?
It might be the first one to get to the finish line.
Yeah.
I've got 8 different ones right now, what I call various stages of Hollywood hell. But like literally nothing has gotten filmed yet. Like I've got some books that have been optioned 2 or 3 times already. Some have this one's got a director, this one's got a writer, this one's got a showrunner, this one's got a star. Next week that person backs out. Now there is no star. Like Hollywood is such a crazy roller coaster. I just try to keep my head in the sand and just write the next book. I know sooner or later it's a numbers game. The more I put out, something's going to get made.
Yeah, definitely. Have you, with the books that have been optioned, have you had any input on things like the screenwriting or the those sort of aspects?
I'm an executive producer on everything, which is something I negotiate into the contract. That being said, they rarely pick up the phone because most of these things, they move like a machine. Like you pick up a director or a showrunner, they've got certain people they like to work with, people that work well together. The last thing they want is the author raising their hand and slowing things down and mucking things up. So I try to stay out of it unless they reach out to me, but I've tried my hand at screenwriting. Ridley Scott's company picked up A Caller's Game and they asked me to write the screenplay for it. I'm no good at it. And my movie ended up being 4.5 hours long, because like when I wrote the book, I felt like I cut out everything that needed to be cut, so like I had nothing I could cut from the, when it turned it into a movie, but like somehow I need to get that down to 2 hours. And that means taking half the story away. And I couldn't bring myself to do it. The odd thing is, that was a couple of years ago and, like streaming has taken off so much since then. Now the streaming companies are looking at it again and they're like, what, I think we can actually do this as is, so even though it's 4.5 hours, that's basically 3 episodes. But they'll do a limited series now without any problem. So I like the fact that the world is evolving that way.
I think so, and it must be a bit easier to write in many ways to film just 3 longer episodes than it is to film a film, because you don't have to cut the story in a certain way that makes it make sense. You can just put it out there.
Yeah, when Fourth Monkey got optioned, that was my very first one. And I had all these phone calls with the directors that wanted it. And the first thing they did is they started telling me about all the stuff they had to take out to get it down to 2 hours. Like this character's got to go. We can't do this storyline. We might have to do this instead. That was really disheartening. And in today's world, like Fourth Monkey, the whole series is with Lionsgate. They're looking at it as a streaming series, basically 1 season per book, 8 to 10 episodes. And they're asking me for like material that I cut out. Like not only can they film what's in the book, but they want something different. So they want material that I took out of the book that they might be able to use. I find that way more refreshing.
Yeah, definitely. Now, just the last question, just before we finish. Obviously your books are all in the suspense thrillers, but they kind of cover a couple of different like categories, such as like horror or mystery. Do you have to wear different hats when you're writing your books, or do you just like write and just see where that structure goes to?
There's no easier way to piss off an agent or an editor than to jump around between one genre to the next. They feel they have to put you in a box, straight off the bat. Like your agent needs to be able to tell the editor, this person is a suspense author, this person is a horror author. The editor turns around and tells the marketing staff the exact same thing. The marketing staff tells the bookstore, where they need to put your book. I hate that. Like the idea of writing the same book over and over again scares the hell out of me. So I purposely bounced around. My first novel was a horror novel. The second one was a thriller. Then I did the prequel to Dracula, so back to horror, then another thriller. What I'm finding is it's almost like being a literary Pied Piper. I've got my core base of readers. They follow me from book to book. I try to tie them all together with suspense as a common thread. So like if you read my Wikipedia page, it says I'm a suspense author who may include elements of horror, elements of sci-fi, elements of this, elements of that. But it's very much like, I look at it and it's almost like another tool. At one point I was told that my audience is female 45 and over. So as soon as I heard that, which is a fantastic audience to have, I wanted to know how I could expand that. So I wrote a young adult book and called She Has a Broken Thing Where Her Heart Should Be. So I immediately picked up, teens. I picked up 20-year-olds and brought them to the fold and changed the dynamic of my reader base. So I'm always looking for that, one project that's a little different, that's going to end up grabbing readers from someplace that wouldn't normally find me. Because I know once I get them, I rope them in and they're hooked.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Now, have you got any tips for people who are just starting out? Because most of the listeners to this podcast are people who are trying to get into industry, or maybe they've written their first book and they wanted to make as many sales as possible. Have you got any tips for people who are just starting out?
You just have to take it slowly. All of this stuff builds over time. I've been at it for 10 years. And, like I said, my email list started at 0. When I first started doing this, I was in the corporate world. I was working 60, 80 hours a week, but I would find time to write, every single day. And I think that's important. It doesn't have to be much, 200 to 300 words, but that'll get you a novel within a year if you can keep up that pace. And what you find is writing is very much like going to the gym. It's like exercising. If you do it every single day, it gets easier. You can do more. You can write more, you can lift more. It's all the same thing. So, I feel that it's important to do it every single day, even if it's just a little bit. There's ways to get that done. Try to write in the same place every day. It's easier if you do that. I listen to a thunderstorm soundtrack, white noise whenever I write. The second I put those headphones on, it's like a Pavlov's dog thing. My brain snaps into writer's mode. Yeah. So I was able to do that anywhere. I could put on my headphones at the grocery store right while I was in line. There's ways to get it done, but I think you need to do it every day.
It's about getting your reps in is basically what you're saying.
Exactly.
Yeah, just like going to the gym. Well, brilliant. It's been fantastic talking to you. Thank you so much for coming on to the show. I really appreciate it. If people are sort of new to your work, where's the best place for them to start with your books?
Easiest place to find me is jdbarker.com. The books are pretty much everywhere. I've got 3 coming out pretty short. I've got We Don't Talk About Emma coming out in February, The Writer with James Patterson coming out in March, and then my next solo title, Something I Keep Upstairs, comes out in May.
Brilliant. And if people are new to your work, which one would you recommend they start with?
Any one of those, or if you really want to go old school, if you're looking for something scary, pick up Dracul. If you like serial killers, The Fourth Monkey is a great place to start.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much. It's been great chatting to you. And just before we go, there's one question I'll ask for everyone, and that is, what's a book you recommend that everyone should read?
Wow. So I'm a huge Stephen King fan. If you're going to read a book on writing, his book called On Writing is probably the best one on craft. I've got a ton of books behind me. That's the only one actually on craft that's up on the shelves there that I pull down on a regular basis. And honestly, I've studied King's work. He's fantastic at creating characters in 2 or 3 sentences. So I tend to read his books when they come out, first as a fan and then as an author. I'll break out the highlighter and I'll go through, particularly his short stories and just highlight every time he introduces a new character, and then study that and break it down. So if you're trying to learn the craft, he's a great person to follow.
Yeah. I read somewhere that Stephen King he gave you permission to use some of his characters in one of your first books. That must have been really exciting.
Yeah, he let me use some of his characters from Needful Things and Forsaken, my very first novel. I got really lucky there.
Yeah, wow. That's really awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming to the show. It's been great chatting to you, and hopefully we'll speak again soon.
All right. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much for tuning into the Publishing Performance Podcast. I really hope you found today's episode inspiring. I love chatting to authors, writers, and people in the publishing world. Now, just before we wrap up, let me tell you about Publishing Performance, the #1 platform for authors who want to increase Amazon book sales, but are not really sure where to start. Now, this show is all about helping you to sell more books. And if you're looking to boost your publishing game and to maximize your book's potential on Amazon, then Publishing Performance is designed to help authors just like you to grow your readership and to reach a much wider audience. Now, I know that Amazon ads can be slightly complicated, which is why Publishing Performance is like having a personalized ad account manager to create your ad campaigns, to choose your best keywords, and to make adjustments in real time. Now, if you're investing in ads, you really want to make sure that your investment is being used effectively, and Publishing Performance does just that. It aims to make your budget go further, improve your organic rank, and target keywords more effectively. Just go to publishingperformance.com to get started with Amazon ads for just $1.